to the Mixtape with Scott. I'm your host, Scott Cunningham, professor of economics at Baylor University. Today, I had the pleasure to introduce you to a friend of mine, Marina Della Guista. Marina is a professor of economics at the University of Turin in Italy. I've known Marina now for a few years. I first learned about her because of an article she wrote on stigma and sex work. And I've always loved it, and it sort of shaped how I thought. And it was over time, I've become closer friends with her. Our conversation today was really interesting, surprised me for some of the twists and turns it took. And I also learned a lot more about Marina's personality that I didn't quite know, and really enjoyed all that, just her willingness to share so much of her story with us. I hope you enjoy this interview, having a chance to listen to Marina's story. And of course, as always, I hope that maybe hear a little bit of yourself in her story. Let's now turn it over to her. Well, it's my pleasure to have a good friend of mine from the profession, Marina Della Guista from the University of Turin. Welcome to the podcast, Marina.
Thank you, Scott.
Will you, for the sake of the listener, tell us again your name, how you because I may have mispronounced it. Tell us your name and where you live, and a little bit, what your job title is.
Yeah, sure. So I am Marina della Giusta, and I live in Turin now as of last year, and I am a professor of economics at the University of Turin.
Awesome. Well, before we get into your life as an economist, I thought we could just sort of start with at the very beginning. Where did you grow up?
So I grew up in Italy, not in this region though. So I was born in Genova, which is a little bit further south on the coast, and then moved through different towns, three different towns, with my mom and dad because of my dad's job, moving around, and that was interesting. I know, Scott, you've been to Italy a few times now, and different Italian regions are very different from each other.
Yeah.
So the experience of moving across Italian regions isn't quite the same as moving across US states, but, there are significant differences for a kid, growing up and going through. I effectively did the 3 levels of schooling in Italy. So primary, and then we have middle school, and then, secondary school. I did primary in Genova and middle school in a place called Trieste, near the border with Slovenia, which was then still Yugoslavia, and then moved to Padua for my high school.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
What did your dad do for a living?
So he was an academic also, but he's a geologist, and both of my parents are geologists, in fact, but in a kind of very, I guess, Italian fashion, though they both held degrees in geology. She became a high school teacher, and he became an academic. What
school was he at?
So he studied in Genoa, and is a boomer, right? It's that wonderful generation that, you study geology then in Italy, and you had like all doors open to you at the end. He had offers from Shell, and he had offers to obviously stay on at university. At the time in Italy, doctorates weren't really a thing yet. I think a very small minority of people my dad's generation would have got doctorates. So they would stay on as research assistants. And because he's a mineralogist, and so he was working a lot on developing also instruments to study minerals. He was also a bit his own technician, so he built stuff in order to do his research with. And then, of course, nowadays it's all much more I guess computer driven, his work as well, and a lot of the machinery has become more standardized. But I think probably he was still in the days where there was a lot of fun to be had in the field, also with the technical side of things, that sort of building things for recording, as well as actually studying the minerals themselves.
Did they meet in graduate school, your mom and dad?
They did, yes.
Okay.
Yes. And yeah. And then I guess, I mean, it's interesting talking to her now. She doesn't feel like she kind of sacrificed the potential academic career, though she was quite gifted as well. But I guess the expectations were different, and maybe even from her point of view, just the fact that she would be supporting his career was taken for granted. There was no real, I don't think they never really had a discussion about that. And my dad, for his generation, again, Italian man, born in the 40s, seemed to me pretty amazing at the time, and still does to a lot of my friends. He was the kind of man who would do the housework, who would do cooking, who would do cleaning. And so it never looked to me particularly unbalanced, or rather, it looked maybe unbalanced, but as a result of maybe just kind of some spontaneous choices. I never questioned the arrangement, to be honest.
Right.
I just grew up in it.
Yeah. You had siblings? Did you have any brothers and sisters?
No, I'm an only child.
Oh, you're an only child? Okay.
I am. So,
Okay.
and moving through towns, it also meant I spent a lot of time with my parents.
Yeah.
So yeah, tightly knit trio.
Well, what was one of your most memorable vacations you took, if you think back?
Oh, wow. Well, vacations with my parents were interesting. So we used to visit grandparents a lot because they weren't living where we were living. And so we used to spend pretty much half the holidays visiting my mom's side of the family at the seaside, and the other half, I was very fortunate. The other half was my dad's side of the family, was in the mountains. I mean, on both cases, I remember, we used to do a lot of walking and a lot of seeing, interesting things. But in hindsight, I kind of realized, I have a lot of pictures of me and my parents, and there's a background of rocks. A lot of families have got like the sunset. In our case, the sunset's like on the other side.
Mm-hmm.
And we're like, we've got the rocks behind. So I'm sure they were trying to pass on this passion to me for nature. And I did like nature a lot. I mean, when I was little, for a long time, I thought, I loved Conrad Lawrence and all his books, and I loved Desmond Morris and all his books, and I loved all the books about how animals behave. And generally, I actually, for a long time, I thought I was going to be some kind of either a zoologist or maybe a biologist. And then I became, maybe I'm going to be an ethologist, study the behavior of animals. And in the end, I ended up studying the behavior of humans. So it's not that far, but yeah.
In high school, or you called it secondary school, is it like in England where you have to go ahead and decide early on, what you're going to specialize in if you go to college?
No, not well. You do specialize early on in a choice of track, but it's very different from the British system in that in Italy you basically had a more academic track, which was at the time basically a couple of types of lyceum, and then a lot of more vocational technical type schools. And the expectation of I guess kids of educated parents who were doing well in school was that they would just choose on the academic track. I don't actually even think anybody explained to me what was available in vocational education at all, to be honest. I mean, schools at the time, middle schools, weren't really offering career advice. It wasn't a thing, but there was just an implicit expectation, kids who did well in school, whose parents were educated, were going to do the same kind of thing their parents did. And it was so for me it was just like, are you going to do a classical lyceum, or are you going to do a scientific one? And because I guess I liked more a mixture of things, and I wasn't quite sure whether it was going to be more humanities or more sciences, I went for the scientific one that seemed to still have both and be a safe bet.
And that felt natural. Did you enjoy those classes?
Some of it did, some of it really didn't. And I must say, interesting, because it would come back when we talk about my own research, but teachers mattered a lot. It was so obvious to me from the start. So in middle school, I had a super inspiring humanities teacher, and a very nice, nothing kind of, earth-shattering, but nice person teaching us maths, and a very inspiring science teacher. And actually they were all women, which I never realized was at the time for that kind of school, not necessarily all that common. When I went to secondary school, to this lyceum, the first maths teacher I had was a very unpleasant and very misogynist man. And there were only maybe a third of the class, or just under a third of the class, were girls, and the rest were all boys. And he was like picking on us, no end. I mean, he was clearly convinced we didn't have it in us to be good at maths. And that impacted us a lot. I mean, I remember, you know, to be honest, I remember I'd also moved town again at that point. I actually remember being very close to tears a couple of times at the jokes it was throwing at us, but not, you know, never really showing it, because it's like, you know, I was going to hold it all in, but it was really hard. And then that changed when we changed, after a couple of years, we changed teacher, and we had a really nice person. And then I went, oh, okay, I like this stuff again, you know. And so just realizing how I was struggling, you know, I was great at it, and then with a good teacher, and then struggling with a really bad teacher for 2 years, and then great at it again, made me think, my goodness, just how much, you know, how much of this is the teacher, at least for me, you know. Maybe some people are better able to abstract from who's delivering, but gosh, you know, I was not. I was really needing to be encouraged. And the performance was just incredible. And I can, you know, this research that is out there, you know, that is trying to split the math anxiety from the test anxiety from the math performance itself. Every time I see those graphs, I kind of see myself.
Right.
And I see, you know, that's like me plus the math anxiety. I'm down here.
Yeah.
You know, I'm at the bottom of that bar there.
Right.
And then, you know, and then you take away the math anxiety, and I'm like up there.
Right.
And that was literally what happened. Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny. It's like there's ways teacher can matter in a negative way. They can be that discouraging, and then they can also withhold encouragement. They could, you know, and they're both pretty damaging, you know, to not validate the student versus just tear them down. They both kind of both have impacts. And
they don't realize how this kind of, it affects you for life, you know, the choices you make, and you know, and how long you stay with this thing, you know. I have to say, I mean, it's funny, but these impressions stay so much in your head, you know. Sometimes I realized when I was in graduate school and I started going to the first conferences, and maybe, you know, there would be some people being very aggressive in questioning you, or questioning other people, but you know, just not doing it in a constructive way, in a way that the feedback could be taken on board. And particularly to young women, I used to instinctively think of this person again, you know, from back when I was 14. I used to just think of him again. It was that scarring. And you know, and I had this thing when I started going to conferences of just kind of going, I'm not going to freeze here, because, you know, when I went to uni then, and I, you know, I did economics at the University of Venice, because we lived in Padua by the time I was in secondary school. So when I finished that scientific lyceum, I enrolled in the economics degree that was then at Venice. So under the old system, I mean, Italy now has a system that is pretty much in line with the Anglo-Saxon system. So there's like a, you know, 3 years undergraduate degree, and then 2 years of some kind of master's. And then if you want to stay on, you can go to graduate school. But the choices then were different, because you really had to commit to a subject and do a full 4-year course, which if you then were interested in doing a dissertation that was kind of closer to trying out research, throwing this kind of sort of pre-doc type work, then you would stay another year. So most people ended up doing 4 or 5 years at uni, even before then going on to specialize in a master's, which was very often abroad at the time, and that's what I did too. But then again, you know, when I did maths, then I had again the same experience. So first maths exam at uni was with someone who wasn't very friendly, and I didn't perform all that well. I passed, but it wasn't great. And then I met someone who was enrolling in an advanced maths, studying chaotic dynamics when I was in the third year. And I just went along, loved the class, asked if I could enroll. And I was top of the class there in this course that only took 15 students a year because nobody could pass it, with the madman who'd written his own book. And I'd studied with Leontiev, would you believe? So
he had studied with Leontiev.
He had studied with Goodwin and Leontiev. Can you believe that? I mean, it was just, and
that's
it was
exciting. Wow.
I know, right? And he had these stories of Leontiev on his bike and all of that, you know, and it was only 15 of us. And he had there, you know, we were like building fractals and programming and doing things like that. This is like the 90s, you know, early 90s, and we're doing this. It's like, why are we doing this? We're economists. But it was fun. Yeah. So I tried to put some of that. I ended up doing this kind of, I asked I applied to do a kind of research type of undergraduate dissertation. At the time at Venice, they let you choose between a kind of compact format or a more extensive research one. And I went for the extensive one. And I had really liked development economics. So I wanted to do something on human capital. And I wanted to work at, you know, investment in education and development, and this kind of, there were all those theories, you know, stages of growth and you know, takeoff models and things.
Yeah.
So I was like trying to do this mapping of education levels and see where there would be a tip-off point, you know, where things would then. And I was trying to simulate this stuff and see. You know, thresholds that would be needed. And it was a really strange dissertation. I think they were very nice to me. I mean, I think I had a good literature review. The empirical part was a bit bonkers because I was just kind of generating my own simulations of what levels of education would be needed for countries to really take off and not like cascade down into some sort of weird place.
That was in graduate school or college or undergrad?
I was an undergrad. Yeah.
Oh man, that would be. I bet that was fun. I bet that was fun for them though, to see you be so excited.
I think so. I think it was fun, but I think that mostly, you know, it was interesting because mostly these people were very supportive, but at the same time, I was mostly left on my own. There was a very distinct system of, I guess, I never realized that at the time, right? I mean, actually, a lot of all of our staff were male, yeah? So at Venice, I wasn't taught by a single woman for my entire undergraduate degree. And most of the top of the class were boys as well. There were some girls who were very good, but, you know, most of them were boys. And the kind of cohort I was in, some of the girls that were really top were very much into econometrics. And so and you know, they were all advised to go and study further econometrics in grad school. And then the other people, yeah, there was this thing that graduate school wasn't really for girls. We just weren't getting any advice. We were like, oh, you're very good. Yeah, you have some interesting ideas. And even though our marks were maybe higher, I don't think they were even realizing they were doing it. You know, this is, I think this was a really interesting case of unconscious bias. We just didn't look the part of the grad student.
Right.
And so, you know, I remember a very good friend of mine who's now a researcher at the Bank of Italy was being given advice, you know, go to Pompeu Fabra or go here, go there, you know, that's where we eventually wound up at Pompeu Fabra, but he was getting advice. And I was kind of going to these meetings asking, you know, if I want to study further, they were like, oh, you know, you could try and apply for a scholarship to specialize abroad. Let's see how it goes. And I won one. And I didn't know where to go, and nobody was giving me any advice.
Right.
So it was really strange. And I guess on my dad's part as well, to be fair, you know, he's a geologist. He had only boys, and he was sending them all to do PhDs to the States, but it never occurred to him that his daughter, who was scoring top marks, should be given the same advice.
You were just invisible to some of them. It was just like they couldn't.
Yeah. I think they thought, yeah, it's kind of, yeah. I don't think they saw any potential, assuming. I think
Mhm.
potential didn't look like this.
Mhm.
And so yeah, it didn't happen. I got this, I did win a scholarship to go specialist abroad. One of my supervisors was very nice, and it was somebody who studied innovation. Is now actually the chief economist at the Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean in Santiago. He was originally from Argentina, and he had been teaching for a while at Venice. After his grad school, he had done grad school in the UK at Sussex, studying innovation and development, and that's what he still works on.
Yeah.
And so he said, go to the UK. And I wasn't sure I wanted to do what he did, which is where he was like, yeah, I can give you advice for this particular area, but if you're not quite sure, he ended up recommending going to Reading. That's how I ended up in Reading, because he knew people there. And also because Reading at the time had a really interesting master's program which taught both the whole development side of things, and it was run together with Oxford University. So Sanjay Alai was teaching development to us in that master's. The School of Agriculture at Reading has some really good people actually, and they were also teaching us. And then there were people coming from Sussex, like Keith Pavitt and really prominent people in innovation teaching us. And so I sort of went there to see a bit, okay, what else is there? But again, never really getting any sense that that I had to approach this professionally, if that makes sense. I was still with this, I suppose, very much Italian of my cohort type gender views, where you've got to be a good girl, and then somebody's going to notice you're really good. You just have to wait, and it will happen, right? And one of the things you come to realize when you then go to an international graduate school is how self-promoted you have to be, just even to have the courage to go and approach people, to talk to them about your interests, or to ask them how to forge a career, or ask them, which are the steps to be taken. Because I'd lived in this, very naive world where we moved towns. I never realized my parents were engineering to stick me in the hardest school there was in the town.
Right.
And I was just always doing very well, but nobody ever thought, okay, what shall we do with her? And she's doing so well. Shall we advise her anything? It was just like next down, another school. I just, I went along with doing the best wherever I was.
Yeah.
And I never questioned very much. I just thought, okay, somebody's going to tell me what to do next. I didn't have a lot of, I guess, initiative in me. I was lucky. I didn't need to have it, maybe.
It's weird that you would say you didn't have initiative, though, because everything you're saying sounds like it would require so much fortitude if you're not being given the encouragement and sometimes even discouragement, but you just keep doing it. What was your skill that you had that made you keep going?
I don't know. I think sometimes I think I'm a bit of a nerd. I mean, if I like stuff and I'm into it, I'll just do it. Yeah.
So you were really interested in economics?
It's interesting. I wasn't at the start, right? So I went and enrolled in economics, to be honest, because of all the faculties out there, it looked the most like my lyceum. It looked like, at the time, a 4-year degree would entail lots of maths and stats, and then later on econometrics, sure. But you had to do history, that was compulsory. You had to do epistemology, was compulsory, as well as obviously all the economics was there. But there were all these other things that were there. We had to do 2 foreign languages. I mean, we had a lot of hours spent on a lot of different subjects. And to me, economics was I'd become a bit political in high school. So I guess I went to it I need to understand the tools of capitalism, so I can dismantle capitalism from within type person. I was always, I think,
right. Totally. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. No,
Yeah.
I just wanted to,
Go inside the enemy and figure out how
yeah,
stuff
like
works.
wreck it from the inside. And then something obviously went awfully wrong, right? Because it's not like academics have that much of an impact on systems, but hey.
Right.
But I wanted to understand how things worked. It was always, the thing is, I guess my story is always been a bit the
Mm.
outsider kid in the school, because I was always coming from another town and I wasn't speaking
Oh,
the local dialect, and dialect in schools was still a thing,
yeah.
when I was little. um, and uh, and I was just not from the place. I had no chance to be cool anyway,
Right.
because I just didn't know what were the cool things.
Right.
And so I was always interested, but I wanted to fit in, right? One
Yeah.
of the things I do is I fit in super well, super quickly everywhere.
Mm.
I pick up people's accents really quickly.
Mm.
And my family always laughs because they say they can tell which colleague of mine I've had lunch with because I've picked up their regional accent over
Mm.
lunch.
Mm.
They can tell if my last call has been with someone like you,
Right.
and then I'm gonna have
You
this
sound like
slightly,
you're from Mississippi if you
yeah,
hang
it's
out with
like
me.
a slightly Mississippi slant when I'm telling off my kids over dinner.
Like,
And if I've spoken to my proper British colleagues, I am going to have totally affected.
that's so
You know,
great.
so I don't know. I wanted to fit in, but at the same time, I wanted to figure out how people fit in, which has
Yeah.
never, it's still
Mm.
my key question about everything. Even the stuff we study together, Scott, is like, I want to understand, how do people fit with a job as strange as being a sex worker? How do people
Mm.
fit in a market that's strange? How do people live differently from the way I live? Because I'm always the one from the outside anyway.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
guess I've developed a set of skills that on the one hand help me fit in and people would talk to me. And that's nice. I started in development when people were still running around doing tons of interviews. For my PhD, I did 250 interviews myself.
Oh
I was
my
like
gosh.
running around with questionnaires in Mexico, asking people questions.
Wow. I want to hear
And
about that.
yeah. So it's that, yeah, I want to know how stuff works. That's
Yeah.
what motivates me. And it still does. It really
Yeah.
still does. I think I'm lucky. I'm intrinsically motivated.
Mm.
And that, lucky and unlucky, right? The system doesn't reward me as quickly as it would
Yeah.
if I was also extrinsically motivated,
Right.
if I understood the
Right.
rules to get by more. But I like what I do, and I still find it interesting, and it's a lot of fun for me, and I've
Hmm.
still done okay.
Oh,
So
wait. So what were you doing in Mexico? This was while you were at the University of Reading?
in between, so I graduated. I went for this master's at Reading, and then at Reading, something funny happened because the people I graduated with at Venice, as I mentioned, one is Professor Mario Cimoli, who's now at the Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, had started working on a project in Mexico, and he was already there.
Mm.
And this was a project of financed by the EU and the Inter-American Development Bank. They were looking, this is very 90s, yeah. So they're looking at the integration of smaller countries into bigger trading areas, so smaller
Mm.
mid-income developing countries. So that meant there were Hungary and I think Greece at the time they're studying, integrating into the EU on this
Mm.
side of the pond. The other side was Mexico getting into NAFTA.
Mm.
And they wanted to figure out what would happen to their productive structures, to innovation, but also they were worried about employment and things like that. So
Mm.
they had won this big project together, and they were recruiting researchers for it. So I was finishing my master's. Sanjay Alal was teaching me from Oxford. It was a Queen Elizabeth House, but teaching on the master's program at Reading where I was.
Hmm.
And Mario Cimoli had already moved to Mexico, and they both wrote to me, "There's this thing. Do you want to come along?" And I said, "Well, that sounds great because I think I need to work now. I don't know how I use this stuff that I've been studying."
Right.
And people were asking me at Reading if I wanted to stay on because they had scholarships and money for grad school then. And I said, "No, can we postpone by a year? And I want to just go and try and do something because I want to understand if this is for me."
Yeah.
And so I went on this project, and I lived in Mexico for a bit of time that year. It was very interesting. We were interviewing people all over the place, different, they were looking at different types of industries, and some of them were really kind of still craftsmanship, and some of them were multinationals. And
Yeah.
it was very nice to talk to people and talk to them about their worries at the time of what would happen. Those were also the years where the whole Chiapas situation was quite hot. And so it's interesting because going back, Mexico was a much safer place to live than it has been since the war on drugs was declared.
Right.
So it wasn't as dangerous, I guess. I lived on my own in Mexico City, and then I lived with other friends, and it wasn't by any means as dangerous as it had become. It has become after.
Yeah.
And then we traveled all over the country, both for these interviews and just for when we had time to just visit.
You were just doing qualitative interviews, or you were doing a survey for
we were doing
regular
both.
people?
We were doing both. And what was interesting is then I realized I was actually pretty good at talking to people. So they moved me from being the kind of person that analyzed masses of data behind the screens to you go talk to people, because very often basically I could just sit there and get a lot of interesting context information around the surveys that wouldn't happen with the other enumerators.
Sure. Well, you said you got that talent of just blending in, but that's kind of a talent of just naturally connecting with people, I bet.
Some of it maybe, or survival skill.
Survival skills too. Yeah.
Your parents move you 3 times between the ages of 10 and 15. You gotta do
right.
with it.
But it was still development. It was still kind of like it was like trade, international development kinds of questions. That was before graduate school. That was between.
That was just before. Just it was between the master's and the PhD.
Which is kind of that continuation from undergrad, where you were doing all those simulations.
No, it was after the master's. So the simulations
but you were maintaining that interest in development that it's like started in college. Yeah. Well, so when you finished that work and you go to the PhD program at Reading, were you sort of saying, I want to continue to study development type of topics, or did something change?
No, I did enroll to study development. What happened was that year while I was in Mexico, I was reading Putnam's book, The Bowling Alone.
The Bowling Alone, yeah.
Yeah. And The Bowling Alone is full of examples from Italy, which I wasn't sure were actually getting to the bottom of what I felt were the issues with Italy. Again, having traveled different regions and having experienced the whole issue of, fitting in and informal versus formal networks and institutions and all of that. But also it wasn't fitting with the story I was seeing in Mexico. And so you probably know, the basic contention in that book was very much that there were different civic traditions in Italy that were formed probably around the time of from the Middle Ages on, really, and that had stuck into people's attitudes towards the state and towards each other across the different Italian regions. And Italy having been unified relatively recently, so just from kind of 80-60, then it meant that a lot of the regional differences that were observable also in civic attitudes, in civic cohesion, in trust in government, and trust between citizens, and the prevalence of formal or informal arrangements, and then of course legal or illegal arrangements, was a product of that differentiated regional history that was formed 200-300 years before. Basically, that was his main argument. And this idea that that there was this amoral familism that was Banfield's definition from the 1950s. It wasn't Putnam's. Putnam just obviously elaborated around it. And I remember at the time I went and tried to read reviews of the book as well. And I remember the Italian economic historians and historians were furious because they
over Putnam's book.
Oh, they were. I mean, they felt there was a lot of, willful misreading of other historical events
Oh,
that weren't fitting with the main narrative. And
right,
I
right.
mean, I guess, I wouldn't ever get into a fight between historians. It looks even bloodier than amongst us economists, doesn't it?
Yeah, right,
You don't
right,
want to go there. Uh,
right.
but I remember, it seemed, I thought, well, that's interesting. I like a controversy around the story, but also what was interesting was having just been in Mexico and being an Italian who was then kind of moving to live in the UK, and my way of going around things being very different from the typical average British student I was hanging out with. I was thinking, okay, there must be something here in the way people forge trust,
Mm,
and the way people use this social capital and these connections in able to do things that we are missing out from the development story, from the story of what forms of capital people need. Because
mm,
at the time in the 90s, the story was still very much about, well, you need your human capital, and of course you need your health, but basically it was all a story about human capital and all those complements to human
yeah,
capital. Yeah.
right,
Health being considered pretty much a complement to human capital.
right,
And
right,
that
right,
was it.
right.
So you had these basic needs frameworks, right? Post 13, and how are we going to measure the human development index? What should we stick in? It was about
Yeah,
calories, nutrition, it was about education, it was about access to sanitation or services.
right.
That was very much it was almost like, you need to educate people, you need to make sure they're healthy, give them gear, and then it's going to happen. And what was fascinating was this story of what do their connections do for them, that I
Mm,
really liked, because again, it felt very close to home, right? I was somebody who always had to move from one place to another, rebuild the connections, didn't have the
right.
connections, and knew what it felt like not having the connections, with all my human capital and my gear, couldn't do much, couldn't get around without the connections, could I?
Mm,
So, and that seemed to be the story as well from all those interviews I was doing in the project in Mexico. People were worried about the integration into these big free trade areas because they
yeah.
saw the opportunities, but they were like, what if it's going to break up all these networks of solidarity we have amongst local producers here? Yeah.
They were
We have
saying
each
that,
other's
yeah, there was
backs.
a lot of anxiety about that in those
Yes,
surveys.
as
Yeah,
well. I mean, there were,
yeah,
of course, in the press, what went through was worries about correctly the
yeah,
price
yeah,
of maize, maybe, or what it would be like for Mexican farmer producers against big farmers from the U.S. But
yeah,
really, for a lot of producers of other sectors, the worry was, and also, will we be wiped out in our uniqueness? Yeah. In what we do, will we just be standardized into the things that are required in order to sell to a big market?
yeah,
And I thought, okay, so people clearly also like the connection element of also of their business, the fact
yeah,
that they are together in a network of other producers,
yeah.
and they were worried about effectively the disruption of their social connections,
Hmm.
business but social connections as well.
Hmm.
So that was the question really. And so when Reading offered me the scholarship and said, okay, will you come this year? I went, yeah, I'll come. And at the time, what you did was you had to prepare a research proposal and say what you wanted to work on. And so I went, okay, I want to work on social capital and development. I want to understand it better.
Yeah.
And sort of this issue of the formal and informal institutions, but also the trust. And
In a
I
primarily development context, or was it just more general?
uh so initially it was just general, yeah. So I started out again a bit like my undergraduate dissertation, just in my own little world. I'll build a model of everything,
Right.
just like, and then let's narrow it down to like one question that is testable. Yeah, that's why I guess that's why I always have a lot of time for my graduate students at the
Yeah,
beginning of the journey.
right.
I like the ones that come with these huge things. And I
Yeah.
go like, okay, let's try it and make this something you can earn a living from. Because you know the field has gotten harder to get into, let's face it. So you need to make sure you put bread on the table with these mates
Oh, gosh.
at some point. So but yeah, so I was like, okay, because in my mind I was like, I want to build a story that explains what really happened in Italy,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
also so I wanted to explain everything, yeah.
Yeah.
But also I wanted a story about how do we measure this stuff, right? I'm an
Yeah.
economist. I was like, I want to measure this thing.
Right.
So if we can measure it, we can detect it, we can do something with it. But also, how do we convince economists that this stuff matters? Because
Mm,
and this was the time when it was James Coleman, it was sociologists working
right.
on this. So it was
Right.
really, Glenn Lurie's work, pioneering work on this. But then it was so educational sociologists working on this.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then there's some people at the World Bank, Collier was already working on it, and
Mm,
Gruttart was working on it, and they published books on this social capital development. But it became an exercise in going into surveys and finding, measures of trust, and you trust others, you trust who do you trust for what, but there wasn't anything tangible that people were setting against that. So I
mm.
was trying to find a problem where you could kind of give this thing a value. And because a lot of the friends I had from Mexico from the 2 years
Were you
prior
sort of
by
get
now.
real quick? Were you sort of getting some sort of advice from an advisor? They were like, you need to make
So
this interesting to economists or something.
So I had two advisors, one who wasn't very interested at all,
Uh-huh.
and one who was and still is a brilliant, I think, mind, Mark Casson at Reading, and
Mm,
of course is the theory of the entrepreneur. Everyone knows Mark for that.
mm,
And he's worked, of course, on social connections very much in the entrepreneurship context. Has never really been into development,
mm,
but he was he's got a great mind, and so it was always, he came on as a second supervisor, but very quickly became the only person I was really discussing ideas with.
mm-hmm.
Um, and he was, I guess, encouraging me to he kept saying, Marina, if there's a line and all economists are here, you're out there, you need to talk to them.
You need to go 1 inch over every day.
Yes, I kind of, can you just come over here? What you're saying is super interesting, but can you just come over
Uh,
here? Because otherwise we have a problem.
how'd you
And
take that?
so
How did that feel when he would say that?
um, I kind of, I'm funny that way. On the one hand, um, I was thinking, I get this thing of I'm either really doing my own thing and super convinced this is like the answer everybody's been waiting for, and
Yeah.
the next second I'm into imposter syndrome.
Yeah. Yeah.
Full
Yeah.
on.
Right.
There's nothing in between.
Right.
And still these days, I have to pace myself in the way I take the feedback from on any work that I do, that I have to just step back and not just kind of willingly completely destroy it the second somebody says it's no good, and I start like jumping on my own sandcastle, yeah,
Right.
to
Right.
flatten it for them even before.
Oh, yeah.
um
Yep.
or alternatively go, no, don't touch it. It's like, this is mine. Don't.
I totally get that. I totally get
Yeah.
that.
And kind of, so finding that happy place between, I don't know, I mean, maybe now I'm like, I still have, what, 20 years before I retire. Maybe I'm getting there.
Yeah.
But it's very difficult when you're building a story mostly in your own head,
Yeah.
and you spend a lot of hours on it, right? It's something you never do later on, because, well, I mean, later on you have a family, you don't do any thinking for a
Right.
certain amount of the day. You're just
Right.
like in kind of, firefight mode. So getting your brain back onto ideas,
Right.
um, you just kind of, you're building your little creature. And so nowadays, for example, I worked a lot on my own at the start. You see, I don't do
Mm,
that anymore because I don't think it's good for me.
yeah.
I think I'm really, I'm not a solo author person. I
Hmm.
shouldn't have been left to be, by the way,
Mm.
especially at the start of my career. That was criminal.
How could you
Um,
tell? What's the what looking back is the signs that you're not a solo author person?
So I think because at heart I'm a problem solver, and I need someone to generate problems with my solutions. You see? So I'll home in on a problem. I can see it's a problem. I can see it's big, and I'm really interested. And I start thinking of, I think, and I have a hunch pretty early on that that's kind of a way that would maybe work to solve it. This is exactly where I need to be with someone else. Not because they need to tell me that's rubbish, this other thing is much better, but they need to start telling me what are the sub problems in my solution. That is where I am at my most creative.
I see. So sometimes you don't see those problems yourself, but others will see it, and then it kind of invigorates you to go solve it, that creative thing. When did you first notice that? Who were you working with when that came alive?
I don't know when I noticed that. I think it's more as in reflection afterwards. So a few years back, when I started being involved in mentoring and teaching grad students, not economics, but how to be an economist. That led me to try and go back into how I got where I was. You know, because I'd spent so many years thinking, I'd made so many silly, uninformed choices. I'd written so many bad papers because I hadn't been really knowing how to write a good paper for so long. And I was not understanding the importance of networks in this job. You know, I was like acting as if I was like a scientist of the 18th century. I have a passion for this. I'm gonna get into it.
There's a lot of hidden. There's a lot of hidden.
It's like, what the hell am I doing? You know, I needed a proper grad school. I needed to understand which conferences you should go to, which not to go to.
And also, the hidden syllabus. There's a hidden syllabus.
Yes. No, and you know, this, you know, when we were conversing about your amazing causal inference work, the fact that you got in there and said, you know, I want to give these tools to people who are not in the top 20s. Because people in the top 20s get this.
They get it.
And everyone else doesn't. And, you know, we want to open those doors, and we want to do it for the good of the discipline. And you know,
and just
so
for
that creativity can really, So I then became conscious of, you know, I was always super self-critical, you know, after this long list of, I went wrong there because I did this, I went right because I did that. And I had to suddenly, because it was supposed to be empowering and it was supposed to help grad students and it was supposed to be part of the mentoring, I was like, okay, here are the things I would do differently now, rather than, oh, this was all wrong, or, you know. And that led me to do a lot of rethinking over, you know, about 8 to 10 years ago, over a couple of years. And then I think 2-3 years ago, I finally had a better understanding of how I got to where I got. And rather than thinking along the lines of, you know, like a good Italian girl brought up with Catholic guilt, right? So I was like, you know, instead of going, what is my fault? What is not my fault? It's like, you know, how long can you just go hitting yourself? I was just like, okay, what went wrong there? And okay, so what would have helped? You know, was I needing a support network there? Was I needing better feedback? You know, I realized, for example, this thing that there's a lot of good literature about nowadays on the fact that women, one of the disadvantages women are at in very male-dominated professions, which ours still is, but used to be much more so when we started, is the fact that we don't get a lot of feedback, actually, not at all. You know, so you know, we get negative feedback, fine. But actually, if you're a bit of a nerd and a weirdo like me, you maybe cry in a corner for a day, but then you're still there. So it doesn't. But the point is, you learn nothing from it, right? Because it's just you're self-chastised for a day, and then you go away. But they didn't give you anything to go on with. So one of the things, for example, I try and teach in my classes to grad students is, okay, take all the feedback that comes, and then and make a note of it, even if it's delivered in the most awful manner. Ignore it, because you know what? This is a problem the deliverer has. It's not your problem. You know, people who deliver feedback badly, whether unconstructively, aggressively, incomprehensibly, anxiously, self-validatingly, that's their thing that's coming across with the feedback. And so a lot of the work has to be, you take it all, and then, you know, it's a bit like a Oaxaca decomposition, really.
Right.
You just, yeah, stick the weights on the stuff and try and clean it progressively till you isolate the pure information you want to have on that piece of work that you presented. Because some of the information you're going to get is about how they feel about you. And frankly, that's irrelevant.
And that's irrelevant. Yes.
Yes, because you want to know, what can you do with this paper to make it better?
Right. Yeah, you know, I mean, I say the same thing to people too. It's like, the goal is extract as much information from a critic, and ignore the noise, which sounds easy because, you know, we all have our own, you know, struggles. And when people are saying negative, critical things about us, we don't necessarily always, it's not easy for some people to extract the signal. They might extract the noise, you know, they might say, I'm a bad person. I'm not a real economist.
But
as opposed
this
to
is a lot of the research I do on unconscious bias, Scott, is exactly saying that. So one of the problems of being stereotyped negatively by people is that it hijacks cognitive resources from the brain. And instead of pushing them in the task at hand, which in this case is receiving feedback, it puts them into defending yourself.
Right.
It kind of blocks out the aggression, but by that, it blocks out also the signal.
Yeah.
And so, you know, that's the real issue with stereotyping people. It reduces, we know, it reduces self-confidence, effort, productivity. And why? Because the brain has precious little cognitive resources. And if half of them are going to be spent worrying about, you know, the way I'm being threatened, then, you know, then the brain can't do anything else. But it's going back to the maths anxiety, right?
It seems like the policy recommendation is oftentimes to change a person, make them stop stereotyping, but really we're all price takers when it comes to other people. And so the work that is needed is to go, these are just words. This isn't real. This is, you know, I have dignity. I have value right now. Some of what they're saying, you know, at least 10% of what they're saying is probably useful. And, you know, you can decide whether or not you want to learn that 10% from this person. Obviously, you know, maybe it's just like not worth it. But, you know, the goal is, why would you ever want to throw away information? That's what I always sort of think is like, you know, if there's signal in the message and it's very noisy, right? It may be that at that time in your life, you just can't extract the signal because it is just too traumatizing. It is too negative. But the ambition is that you could become able to just ride that and not be able to be so triggered, you know, because that's a really valuable skill in general, is to handle your own inner distress.
I think there's just two things that I'd like to say to that, because I think what you're saying is so important, and at the same time, you know, there is that what you personally do when these things happen. And I do give a lot of advice also on just trying to just, if it gets too aggressive, just say, can you stop there, because I'm not sure I'm hearing what you're saying.
Right.
And try to repeat back to them the one thing you think seemed useful or what they were saying, and ask them if they can clarify it, which in any case interrupts them, makes them maybe, you know, typically when you interrupt people, they scale down a little, refocus.
Right.
You know, some people don't, some people get more aggressive, but the other thing is, and we've had this conversation just very recently at the Royal Economic Society about the kind of culture of economics we want to encourage, including at seminars and including at conferences.
Yeah.
And, the current chair has some very interesting ideas about encouraging chairs at the conference to take responsibility for the meetings they're chairing in terms of making sure these things don't happen. And they're ready with a strategy of supporting the speaker, interrupting people who are, and just kind of reframing things so that the atmosphere stays collegiate and the criticism is delivered in a constructive rather than destructive manner. But it is delivered, because the other thing you don't want, as you said, is throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah.
The other thing is that, with this stereotyping thing that's fascinated me so much in the last few years, because, we study inequality, that you end up at some point, trying to decompose bits again. And this unconscious part is very interesting. When you start studying it, of course, not only we're all at the receiving end, we're all at the giving end, because the stereotyping is a thing that the brain does, and it will always do. It's a bit like Marina without glasses will never see Scott, and with the glasses, she always will. So the point is, we need to understand that there are some features, inner features of generating expectations that come unconsciously, which bring stereotyping, that are just how we function. And the more we accept that and understand that, the more we start to learn ways to counter the effects of stereotyping.
Right.
And ways to make that less of I guess less of a discriminating, because that's what it is, factor in our interactions with others, both at the giving and at the receiving end. Because you actually, when somebody is stereotyping you violently, of course it feels awful, but ultimately it means they have no direct information on you, and all they can do is project this whole barrage of ideas they might have about, middle-aged Italian women wearing round glasses must all be like, and you're just kind of needing to say, okay, actually, this one's Marina. Would you like to know her?
Yeah.
And that's where having techniques is important, and tons of really useful techniques from psychology, that can be deployed. And I've been trying to give graduate students advice in that respect. And I think hopefully we're coming to cohorts that are more and more expecting more mutual respect. The environment has got so hard, and actually so much harder, that I think people are beginning to also look out for each other a bit more. And also, I just think, I think there's going to be a generation of graduate students coming to us in the coming years who've been so badly affected by COVID anyway, that we are not going to be able to just pretend that our profession can't allow itself to be soft, that unless you're delivering criticism in a particular manner, you're not delivering criticism. I think there's going to have to be some collective rethink in those cohorts. I think really from my age up, I've seen it less and less in the younger people. I mean, some of them still do it, but I've seen it less and less. But that really, unless criticism is delivered constructively, then it means you are not able to communicate effectively.
Right.
I think the need to be good communicators is become more of an issue for economists, and more economists are aware that this is an issue. I don't think it was a valued skill at all when we were in graduate school. I mean, some of the instructors I got, they were great, but you couldn't understand the word they were saying, literally. And so it was clear that they hadn't been told, you have to go in there to talk to these kids, and you need to make sure they understand you.
They understand you.
Now we do,
the goal,
right?
I guess this is where people have to decide what their goals are. What is your goal? Is your goal to tear a person down? Is it to grandstand, or is it to what would you say the goal is, of delivering
criticism? The goal is to bring anyone who's got a passion and some talent for economics to do it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And take away the word economic and take any word in. That's what we should be doing, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
If we are in any shape or form involved in educating the next generations in our fields, whatever those fields are, we should be looking out for interest and talent and nurture it. And if we can't do it, then we shouldn't be educators. Then it's not our job. It's fine. Not everyone likes to do this.
Yeah.
And it's okay, but I think there are more institutions now that will not accept that kind of scholar that shuns students. I think there's much less acceptance of that. Because I see it denounced publicly as a behavior we don't want. And 10 years ago, Scott, who did that?
Yeah, sure.
It actually, if you said this something like that happened to you, you would expose a weakness.
Mm-hmm.
Amin and I never said it when it happened to me. Ever. I was always hiding it. Even when I was reduced to tears at conferences, I always hid it. I never said it. Absolutely not. And I don't think that's I've seen seminars with graduate students where somebody has got a bit more aggressive and the others have started clamoring and rumoring in the back about it. That's a different culture there. Maybe I'm over optimistic, but I think there is.
Yeah. Well, I am encouraged by your optimism. That's I'm gonna try to be hopeful myself. I've witnessed some pretty antagonistic speech in the profession myself, and it's challenging for sure. Well, Marina, it is so not. We didn't even get to talk about. Maybe we can do it again on another podcast and talk about your work on gender and sex work. But everything we spoke about was just so wonderful. It's so nice to always talk to you, and I really appreciate hearing your story like this.
Likewise, Scott. It was really good to talk. And whenever you want, we actually get to talk about research next time.
That's right. Okay. All right. I'll talk to you later.
Yeah. Talk later. Bye.
Gotta see us through. Honey, you need me. Baby, I need you.